We are going to be looking at custom tuning or retuning Matt Jones' suspension for Hardline. They're some of probably the biggest jumps in the world, certainly some of the biggest drops, mixed with a really fast World Cup downhill. So it's like going to Rampage, but also riding a World Cup, which is quite a unique sort of situation in terms of setup and suspension and stuff. So he's going to come in later and I'm going to fit a load of tweaked bits to his Olin suspension. And the very first thing to do is to look at the data. So we've got some dyno data from Olin's that shows us the force versus velocity curves, basically. So how much force is applied at what speed the shaft is moving at. I've had a good look through this. Now the general shape of each of these force curves starts off very, very steep. This nods towards the low speed part of the shock working. So that's low speed force. You then have this kind of shoulder here where low speed kicks in here. That's all low speed. And then you've got your release of your high speed pressure in your shock. And that just allows the shock to move a little bit more under high speed. These C20, C80, DHC40 and DHC70 are our different tunes that we have available from Olin's. These are predetermined by Olin's, they're not custom tunes. They are based on lots of dyno testing on Olin's dyno in Sweden, and it is the most amazing dyno you've ever seen. So I trust their data entirely. So we're going to use what shim arrangement they recommend, basically. For Matt, because he's not the heaviest rider and he doesn't use clip pedals, I'm going to go with a DHC 40. Relatively smooth, low speed curve, and then a middle to high speed force on that tuning. There are two above that are higher. There's a C80 and a DHC 70, which are up here. But what I tend to find with riders that use those tunes is you can get away with that if you run clip pedals. So when stuff gets really harsh and you're really smashing into rocks and you're a really fast rider, you can deal with that level of compression resistance in the shock, especially if you've got clip pedals on, because your feet don't tend to bounce too much off the pedals. If you're running flat pedals, I tend to find that you need to tune the shock down a little bit on compression. So we're going to go halfway, basically. So that's our compression. Rebound, we're going to do something similar. You can see this R80 here has got a really nice, smooth, progressive rebound force curve to it. And these are, like I say, the biggest jumps in the world. And he's going to be hitting them super fast. So the shaft speeds of the bike, I think, are going to be more regularly in this region than they would be on a normal track. I'm just assuming that really you should take telemetry data from the track, but we're just going to assume that he's going to be hitting takeoffs really, really hard and he's going to be going deep into his travel. So we're going to go with that. I'm going to tune it all now. So I'm going to show you all the shims out. We'll have a look at this compression assembly that I've got here. We're going to prep that. There's a couple of other little secret bits I'm going to do to it to make it extra good. We're going to size the glide ring to make it super smooth. And then when Matt comes in, we can fit it to his bike, do his setup, and then he can go and test it before he goes to New Zealand. Come with us whilst we get geeky and look at some shims. So that's our piston assembly apart. We've got our first section here, which is our rebound shims. And then we've got the second section, which is our compression shims. Now with Olin's, it's a two-stage process that the shock goes through to apply compression force. These shims, the compression shims, are on the piston, and that piston displaces fluid into another valve where your adjuster is. Now, if you make these shims stiffer on the piston, you displace more fluid into the adjuster compression valve, and that effectively overworks that valve, making the compression force softer. which is counterintuitive. So you add more shims and it actually gets softer. Whereas if you reduce the amount of shims and you make that displacement less, you underwork the adjuster valve and you get a harder amount of force in the shock. I hope I explained that right. It can be quite mind-bending, but with these base valve or main piston and secondary piston systems, it's all about how much fluid you're displacing into another valve that gives you the higher or lower damping characteristics. Now that is split across high speed and low speed, of course. So we do actually have adjusters to think about as well. I want Matt to be able to go and give himself more support, the maximum amount of support that he can get if he needs it, because he's racing this crazy track. That said, I also want him to be able to come back and open the dampers up. The reason that's important is, especially for compression, is when you're learning a track, it's really important to have the wheels move and get out of the way, because you don't really know where the bumps are yet. So you're sort of anticipating the bumps rather than pushing into them. When you learn the track and you start to really push into bumps, that's when you need to bring compression on, high speed compression, low speed compression. You need to add more of it to give you more support and more chassis stability. So that's what I want to give Matt the ability to do, and we'll talk to him when he's in, when we do the bike setup later, and I'll go through with him how he can use his high speed and low speed compression. He is a pro rider, so I'd like to think he knows that, but there's every chance he doesn't, because I know the guy. This is your base valve, your main piston that displaces fluid into your adjuster assembly, and this is what sits in here. And this houses the non-return shim or check valve, which stops the fluid going back through the piston. You've got your low speed needle in here, your needle adjuster, which is adjusted off of this blue dial, and that just covers more or less of this hole here, which increases your low speed compression. And then your high speed is all through the shim arrangement and how many clicks of this dial you have. When you do apply a high speed compression adjustment on here, it changes the fulcrum point of a shim. So if you imagine your shim is a leaf spring and it does this, when you adjust your adjuster, it just moves the fulcrum point of that shim like that, and that stiffens that shim and means you have to apply more force to get it to lift. I think that makes sense. In here, I've got lots of shim packs direct from Öhlins. Basically, from those charts, I can select the correct arrangement of shims to give me the desired damping force that we saw on the charts. Now, that shim arrangement chart, I'm not at liberty to share with you. That's part of our agreement when we become an Öhlins service centre. If you want a shim tune or you want to change the way that your Öhlins shock performs, come and see us and we can do all this for you as well. So you can get the same treatment that a pro rider does, a Matt Jones, whoever. So come see us and we can do all this for you as well.
Yeah, which is a medium case.
So we've just got the rebound shim arrangement out. Not a huge difference. There's a few sort of wider shims at the top and then more of them. So there'll be more preload on the shim when you tighten the bolt down at the top of the shim stack, and the fulcrum point will be slightly further out because there's wider shims on the top. Our compression shims arranged quite a bit different to what was in that stack before. 2 more face shims, so much firmer face shims. Let's get this loaded back up onto the piston and we'll prep the piston to go onto his shock shaft and back into his bike. So I'll polish these shims up and get it built. That's our piston assembly back together. We'll get that onto a piston shaft and I'll just run it through a sizing tool. Now, this piston band that seals the piston up against the damper tube doesn't always fit perfectly in the piston recess, and it can wobble a little bit. You can end up with a little knock at the top of the travel. It's really, really annoying. So we'll run it through the sizing tool. So that's all done, that's prepped. Next job, with the fork especially, I find that this is a main area where you can get tons of hand fatigue, especially on a really long track like that. That track in Tasmania, I was looking at the videos last night, is a really long track, and it's actually quite rough. There's really high speed bits. So we want to get this fork in the first 2 inches of travel as soft as we possibly can. We want it to be really supple, really smooth, respond really quickly to bumps. So there's a couple of things we can do. One of those things is to polish and use some thinner lubricant in the air spring. The other one is to size the bushes and again use some super fast lube. The dampers in these forks are pretty spot on out the box, so it's not something I'll be really doing much on. The ramp in this fork is all in here, so it's got a floating piston, and actually we talked about this quite a lot on a previous video. We did Fox versus Öhlins, so go back and have a look at that video if you want to see how the ramp system works in this fork. But I'm actually going to be applying volume spacers to the ramp chamber of this air spring. I'm also going to be removing the negative air volume spacer out of the negative air part of this air spring as well, just to give us a little bit more suppleness off the top, but then add a volume spacer to stop the air spring accelerating too much into its travel by me taking that spacer out. So lots going on actually in just some tubes with air in, but let's get into it, take it apart. This is our very technical ramp chamber volume spacer. That is an official Öhlins part, and that goes in there like that. The cool thing is that this isn't Matt's air spring at the moment. He's already got one in his bike, so I can make one that's going to be like super rampy, what I think he should run. But if he doesn't like it throughout the week, he can swap it out for his old one. So it's always nice to have these things just ready to go. And the great thing about the Öhlins air springs is it's a cartridge, so you can have multiple cartridges. You can actually even have multiple travels, and they're really, really quick to just change. You can change the travel of your fork really, really quickly. So that's our air spring back together. That's everything prepped. I'm just going to charge the air spring. If you want your suspension tuned, jump onto the Plush suspension website, get your... We're consummate professionals here. If you want your suspension tuned and set up, jump on the Plush suspension website. You can book your bike in or your suspension in for full service, and we can do some tuning work for you and a setup when you collect. I guarantee your bike will feel $1 million after it. It really does make a massive, massive difference. And even if you think maybe it's not something for you because you've just started riding and you might think you might not notice a difference, you will notice a difference. This is more than 10, 15, 20% increase in performance. This is quite a big change, especially if you've just bought a bike, got it out of the box and gone riding. This setup or this kind of tuning makes a huge, huge difference to the way the bike rides. And then in the setup, which you'll see in Matt's video if you jump on his channel, you'll see the whole setup process and how we hand you the tools of how to use and unlock all your adjusters and how to use them properly. So yeah, jump on the Plush site, but for now, we are done.